I want to thank Chancellor Blumenthal for this opportunity to speak here at the center. This isn't my first time here. I was here back in 2002, 2003 timeframe as a visiting scholar, working with John Douglas and Marion Gade, and got some nice opportunities to chat with an icon in our world, Clark Kerr, at the time, and that was a great experience. Stayed right here at the faculty club, so when the opportunity came to come back, I'm like, no, I'm going to stay there again and sweat all night, because it's about 20 degrees in Fairbanks right now, so this is very warm. So I thank everyone for this opportunity to talk, and to do so in an atmosphere that is less perhaps vitriolic than a lot of what's going on in Alaska right now. In the last 6 months, literally, it started on February 14th in 2019. The University of Alaska has been featured on the cover of the Chronicle of Higher Ed a couple of times, New York Times with a picture. My mom was pretty happy about that, but I said, Mom, read the article. This is not good. Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and needless to say, virtually daily front page above the fold coverage in Alaska papers. And I don't read them anymore, and that is the submissions and the comments and on the social media, which are just really horrible. So, in any case, I would much prefer to report to you all today that the University of Alaska was on the cover of all of those great newspapers and magazines because of, for example, the climate research we do. We lead the world in publications and citations on Arctic research. And most of that is climate research. And it makes sense because that's where it's happening. It's happening at twice the rate there as it's happening here. It's of course very important work. Melting glaciers and melting permafrost, and even the oil companies get it. They understand. They're actually funding quite a bit of the research that we do. Ocean acidification and its effect on salmon and marine mammals. That would have been nice to have had coverage of that. Or the dynamic relationship between snow cover and retreating snow cover and wildfires. You have them here. We have them many times larger. Of course, there are hardly any people who are threatened by them. But a big challenge there. Earthquakes and volcanoes. I know you're really into earthquakes here. We are too. And we also have volcanoes that get active every now and again. It would be interesting to have coverage of that. Or to explore the fact that we have more drones than any university in the country. And it makes sense if you ever look at a map, or if you've been to Fairbanks in particular, which is our research university, you would see this vast space. And so the drones are very active in mapping and managing wildfires, looking at the 800-mile-long oil pipeline instead of having people look at it every single day. It's really nice to have drones do that. Counting wildlife, very, very important that we know how many caribou are in these huge herds. And you can either have human beings flying in airplanes, very dangerous, doing that work, or you can have drones do that. So it'd be a whole lot better if the coverage in those papers were about those things. Or to probe, I was mentioning to George here, our NASA-funded rocket range and its studies of the aurora borealis and how the aurora affects telecommunications between layers of the atmosphere. And you've all heard about our vice presidential candidate, Sarah Palin, some years ago, who used to say that she could see Russia from her porch. Well, she can't see Russia from her porch, but we can at the university via satellites and via huge X-band radars and other sensors that we use on behalf of the government. To develop new ways to think about integrating power sources. We have a big microgrid in Alaska. We're not connected to the electrical grid here. So how do we connect wind, solar, tidal, coal, battery, diesel power, and do so in environmentally sensitive ways? Those are big challenges, and we'd love to have that be the subject of what we're covered by. We'd love to have coverage of the incredible understanding we have and are gaining that comes from 15,000 years of human experience in Alaska. Alaska Native people have indigenous ways of knowing that are very, very powerful, and we're very proud of how we involve them in a lot of our research, funded research work, NIH-funded research, for example, looking at integrative approaches to environmental studies, animal studies, and human health. Or maybe that coverage would be about Title IX and how we came out. We were the first university, according to the Office for Civil Rights, who proactively disclosed serious challenges and problems back in 2015 in the arena of Title IX. Or that 9 of the top 10 private companies in Alaska are owned by Alaska Native people. 9 of the top 10 companies, and many of our alumni are the CEOs of those for-profit corporations. So that'd be pretty cool. Or that we've doubled the number of engineers and the double number of nurses that we've trained to grow more of our own people in Alaska, because we're still very much a colony, a resource extraction colony of the American Empire. And so it's really critical for us to really grab more control over the destiny of our own state by training more Alaskans for those important jobs. Or perhaps that we serve the largest geographic area in the country. We have 3 universities in our system, 13 community campuses. The southernmost community campus is 1,300 miles from the northernmost community campus. 8 of the 16 campuses are inaccessible by land. So I have a lot of air miles. And in fact, if this is what Alaska looks like, so you can use your right hand to do this, and we touch the Atlantic Ocean. If you transpose us onto the lower 48 states, as we refer to you, we touch the Atlantic and we touch the Pacific. So it's geographically huge. It's actually 4 times the area of California, although our population is actually California's population is 56 times Alaska, so you get a sense of the population distribution, which is a lot of glaciers and a lot of mountains. But instead of all that cool stuff, and there's a lot more cool stuff that I could have talked about, that coverage was all about the governor's decision on February 14th to cut our budget by 41% in 1 year. And it was kind of interesting because he used to work for the university. He was a former educator. He was a school superintendent. We thought, he could be a friend. He actually opened himself up to conversations with me where I said, hey, Governor, you're a Republican, but there are Republican governors out there across the country who are education governors. And I mentioned Tennessee, and I mentioned Kentucky, and Georgia, Massachusetts right now. And I said, it's all about competitive capacity. It's not just our resources. It's about the competitive capacity of our people. And he said, okay, and we'll talk. And we shook hands. And then on February 14th, whammo, 41%, 1 year budget cut. And that's on top of 15% we took the previous 4 years, involving 1,200 layoffs. Walking into February 14th, I'd already laid off 1,200 faculty and staff across the university system. So pretty painful. All the while, the state has $70 billion in savings. $70 billion in savings. That's the equivalent of about $100,000 per citizen in a savings account. So we have all this money and we're going to cut things. Now the big reason why we're going to cut things is the governor's campaign promise, which was to pay the full dividend. So we take a portion of our savings account, that oil savings account, we pay a dividend to every Alaskan. Some would say, wow, that's a universal basic income idea. Good on you. Well, it accounted for 37% of the state's expenses and caused a budget deficit. But for the dividend, we'd have a surplus. And K-12 would be happy, healthcare would be happy, the university would be happy, all the municipalities across the state would be happy. But that was his campaign promise, and he was going to stick to it. After the governor proposed that cut, the legislature restored most of it. So good stuff. We worked hard. We had a privately funded advocacy campaign. It was very successful to restore that cut. And then on June 28th, I remember this day very painfully. The governor, I met with him on May 31st, and I introduced to him the concept of a glide path or a compact. And actually, I want to thank people here at the center for sharing with me some of the history of the University of California and its budget relationship with the state. And so I took some of those ideas and proposed a concept to the governor on May 31st. The New York Times in its article, referenced that, that meeting I had with the governor. And again, he said, we'll talk. And we talked again on June 28th when he called about an hour before issuing the budget vetoes, and he vetoed it all the way back down to the 41% cut. So that was a pretty rough day there. And the specific target was university research. His O&B staff had presented to legislators, and it was all about, workforce, that's fine, train welders, train process technicians, that's cool, teachers, nurses, but that research you folks are doing is really not important for our state, so let's cut that. And he actually proposed separate appropriations in order to target that reduction to our research university. One of our 3 universities is a research university, a research 2. So the legislature came back into a special session, again restored most of the cut. But meantime, the Board of Regents is telling their employee, hey, you can advocate, that's great, keep advocating, but what are you going to do about this thing if it happens? You have to have plans. You have to have contingency plans. We have students out there, we have faculty out there, we have programs. You have to cut this money. We can't operate in deficit. We don't have huge savings accounts. We don't have reserves. So we were planning for the worst. And so the Board of Regents, at my recommendation, declared financial exigency, which is an unprecedented thing for a university to do. It's not bankruptcy. It's frankly a matter of our union contract with our faculty that enables us, without program review and without notice, to terminate tenured faculty. That is really an unprecedented thing to do, but when you're looking to cut 41% of your budget quickly, in year, you have to look at steps as serious as that. We suffered a 3-notch downgrade in our credit rating. Only time Moody's has ever done that. The only university below us was Puerto Rico. So there's another gut shot, while we're trying to advocate for more money. We reviewed the possibility at the Regent's direction of consolidating duplicative academic programs. So we had 3 schools of education, 2 schools of management, 2 schools of engineering, ... Why don't you put those things together, reduce administrative costs, and through online and other means, you can still deliver education across the state. So we started doing that, which gets people riled up, right? Which school is going to be the one that survives? Internecine conflict really kicked off in spades within the university. So folks say, wait, you're the expensive one, why are you looking to cut me? And so a lot of struggle within. Consideration of moving from 3 accreditations, institutional accreditations, to a single accreditation. Unprecedented move, but it would certainly save money because we wouldn't have as much administrative superstructure, if you will. Very complex thing to do, but that was on the table. So pretty much everything that you can imagine that's really bad was on the table during this time. And of course, what was happening too, our star faculty were going, do I want to stay here? I'm a hotshot atmospheric physicist or oceanographer or whatever. I think I'll go someplace that is aspiring to lead in Arctic research, or graduate students, or postdocs, or name it. Donors, philanthropic donors. Do I really want to write a check to you guys? I'm not sure you're going to be able to deliver on the promise that you're making to me. So the legislature went in, and so all of this is happening on one side. At the same time, I'm fighting, trying to get legislators to override the veto that the governor made. And in Alaska, it takes a 3/4 vote of the legislature to override the governor's veto. And he has line item veto authority. So he vetoed actually 182 lines in the budget. He pretty much hit everybody, but especially the university system. The legislature was unsuccessful at overriding the veto. In fact, the legislators who opposed the governor were meeting in the Capitol building, and those legislators who supported the governor went and met in Wasilla, Alaska, his hometown, at Wasilla Middle School, and had a legislative session out there. The governor hung out with them. Meanwhile, the majority of the legislature, but not a supermajority, was sitting in the Capitol, planning for this override. So the override didn't happen. However, as this started, then the legislature did pass another bill, okay, and that was set up for another veto. He, however, agreed not to veto that. And so, borrowing on this compact model, I was able to negotiate, instead of 41% in 1 year, 20% over 3 years. Still a serious challenge. And I actually got a call from a friend, Peter McPherson, a mutual friend of ours, who's the head of the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. Great person. And he called and said, "Hey Jim, you just moved from the impossible to the very difficult." And I thought, okay, yeah, that's a fair assessment of the situation. Now let me, one of the last Chronicle articles, the cover of it said, "Where to from here? University of Alaska, where are you going as a result of this?" And I want to answer that question for you, and then open it up for conversation. But I think it'd be helpful to get a little bit more of an overview of Alaska before getting into that. Life in Alaska is expensive. We lead the country in healthcare cost, transportation cost, energy cost, despite the fact that we're an energy state, and education costs. And I'll talk about some of these numbers in just a minute. This is especially the case because there's so much of Alaska is rural. Again, I said 8 of our 16 campuses you can't drive to, period. So if you're going to get to them, you're getting them by air and maybe by water. Although in the wintertime you can get to them by river, because the rivers freeze and they become highways, right? So people run on the rivers in the wintertime. But rural education is very expensive in general. Very small class sizes, very high teacher turnover in K-12 particularly. Education, we all probably think, I would offer, that we always think it's an inherent good. But in rural Alaska, you have a lot of Alaska Native people there, and it's only been 2 to 3 generations now when the Western influence has been there. And education was used as a weapon, not just a good, not just a path to a better future. It was used as a colonial weapon. No, you can't speak your native language. No, you can't dance like you have for several thousand years. No, that art you're doing, heathen. Put that aside. And so it has very negative implications also. So it's interesting because, again, we think of it as an inherent good. It's got 2 sides in rural Alaska, and we're still navigating through that challenge today. There's also a lot of out-migration from rural Alaska to the cities, where the schools are better and where employment is and where there's economic opportunity. At the same time, the university and K-12 has been extremely innovative in Alaska Native programs. A great example is the Alaska Native Science and Engineering program, largely funded by oil companies, that targets bright 7th graders wherever they are in the state, gives them a computer in a box that is not assembled, and says, assemble the computer and pass algebra by 8th grade, you're in the program. And so every summer while they're in high school, they come onto the university campus, and then they have mentoring during the school year. And then when they come to the university, and most of them do come to us for college and then on to graduate school, they have paid internships every summer with oil companies, with Alaska Native corporations. And as I mentioned, 9 of the top 10 companies based in the state are Native-owned corporations. So these are very successful companies run by very smart people. So it really is a great success story, I think. And it has, I think, tapped into, again, an intrinsic sense of pride and confidence among Alaska Native people. They have tremendous values, resilience to have lived in this really harsh place for about 15,000 years. So that, I think, is a really positive success story. Alaska, the biggest city is Anchorage, so half the population lives in Anchorage. There are over 100 languages spoken in the Anchorage School District today. I looked it up last night, it was 101. So it's probably more than that right now. So huge, diverse population. Another really challenging fact about Alaska education is that only 33%, if we packed in 100 average 9th graders into this room, only 33 would go on to any higher education. 33. It's the lowest in the country. So not a good number, right? Alaskans often talk about the brain drain. That's the smart kids who go to Berkeley for college as opposed to the University of Alaska. Actually, it's a brain gusher that's happening in the state when you're thinking about 67% not going on to any higher education. So that's the one I focus on right there. So that's been a serious challenge. You know, there's a correlation, I bet George has seen this over the years, or Brian, or other students of higher education, correlating education attainment with income. Decennial census data, and I think nowadays it's above 0.8, the R squared on that correlation. Right? Okay. Alaska's way off the line. We're a high income, low education state. You know, a high schooler with a clean drug analysis and a graduation from high school can start in the oil patch at $90,000 a year, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off today. And hey, mom and dad did that. Why would I borrow money and spend X years, you know, going to college? I'm just going to do that. I can get to Y whenever I want to. I can hunt when I want to. But that's not really going to create a more diverse economy, obviously. So that's one of our challenges in the state. Describing the university a little bit here, we were founded in 1917 as the Alaska Agricultural College and School of Mines, and opened up in 1922, first graduate in 1923. In 1935, it was changed by the territorial legislature to be the University of Alaska. In 1956, the Constitutional Convention met at the University of Alaska and drafted up a constitution, which essentially was a sales document, and was able in 1959 to get statehood. And the Constitution includes specific provision for the university in it. It does have some degree of constitutional autonomy, except there are a few words that have created problems over the years, and that is the Board of Regents shall govern the university, comma, subject to law, period. And of course, I'd love those words not to be in there because then we could choose which laws we wanted to abide by and which not. But it does mean that obviously we're subject to legislative, statutory law. Through the 70s, community colleges formed up, but they were all consolidated into the 3 regional universities in 1988, the last time we had a big oil price crash and recession in the state. Today, 26,000 students across the system. Fairbanks is the flagship research university. About 6,000 students, but about $150 million of research a year, which for such a small school is actually a really big number. UA Anchorage is about double that in size, comprehensive university. All of our healthcare programs come out of there. And then UA Southeast is one of the most beautiful campuses on the planet, notwithstanding Santa Cruz. You can stand at the UAS campus, see a glacier and a glacier-fed lake, and turn around and see the Pacific Ocean, a beautiful bay with ships and white-capped mountains, sort of fjord-type country in the background. So little liberal arts type college there. I mentioned to you the very low college going rate in Alaska. The national 4-year completion rate is 34% across the country. Ours is 10. The national 6-year completion rate is 64%. Ours is 31. The national cost per completion is $66,000. California's $79,000 across the entire state. Alaska's $103,000. So when people look at the cost per in Alaska, you know, obviously very, very high. Politically, we are a red state, although the majority of registered voters in the state are independent. Then comes the Republican Party, then comes the Democratic Party. All 3 members of Congress representing Alaska are Republican. They vote generally as a bloc, particularly on resource development issues, but not on social issues. So you may be aware that Lisa Murkowski is our senior senator, voted against the confirmation of recent Supreme Court justice, which makes it very controversial for her, frankly, in the state. She was, in 2000 election, she was primaried out. And it was only through a write-in campaign, first since 1954, that a candidate was written into the United States Senate and won. So pretty interesting there. The governor is a Republican with a very libertarian bent. Is a former state senator, former school administrator, again, whose platform when he ran for office was a full dividend and a smaller government. He wanted to open Alaska for business and get the state out of the way of that resource development. Now, in many conversations I've had with him, I've said the only way you're going to open the state for business is through educating the people. But we saw where that went. Obviously, didn't want to add any taxes either. We pay no state taxes. Individuals do not pay taxes in the state. Basically, government is paid now increasingly by earnings off of our big savings account and then oil royalties and taxes. Now, the election was really interesting because the incumbent governor, who was an independent, was running for re-election. And the successful governor was running against him as a Republican. And then a former US Senator, Mark Begich, came in to compete. And so he was splitting the independent incumbent's vote. But about, I'm going to say it was 3 weeks or so before the election, the very popular, very powerful lieutenant governor, Alaska Native leader, highly, highly respected, was not criminally charged, but in the media charged with sexual harassment. So he, within a day, resigned from his position as lieutenant governor and withdrew from the campaign and the election. And then very quickly the governor said, I'm out. So the incumbent governor is out, and that leaving two candidates, and Governor Dunleavy succeeded. Once in office, citing falling oil prices and state revenue projections, of course, tied to oil, the governor then started talking about big budget cuts, so cuts to K-12, us, healthcare, and others. And as I mentioned, this created a huge budget deficit, $1.9 billion just for the dividend itself. This is this $3,000 payment to everyone. Now, many of those cuts were restored through the process, but the governor is still in office. And while he has let some people off the hook, he's coming after others this coming year. Now, one thing that's happened that's very interesting is there is a recall effort now, and it's a three-step process. The first step is to get and I don't remember the exact percentage of the registered voters from the previous election to sign a petition saying we want to submit a proposal for a recall. They got 49 signatures instead of 24,000. So that proposed recall is now on the Attorney General's desk. He's, of course, appointed by the governor. So he's reviewing the legal grounds. It can't just be, we don't like the guy, or like, whatever. It's got to be legal grounds. And those are being reviewed now. If the Attorney General agrees, then it'll move on to a much bigger petition, 79,000 signatures or something like that. If the governor disagrees, obviously it's going to court. Now, interestingly, one of the vetoes the governor made this past year was the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court made a decision last year on an abortion rights case. The governor didn't like it, and so he vetoed the amount that was needed to fund that program. So it'll be interesting to see how the case goes if it does go to court. I'm sure the judges will be very unbiased and fair in their decision. They're very, in fact, many of them were trained just a little ways from here, actually. So, but they're great judges, and I'm sure they'll do well. But that is, that's an interesting thing. The governor now is talking at nationally, Fox News, and cloaking himself a little bit with the president's issues, and so the politics here continue. On the federal front, it's interesting. The federal delegation in Alaska is, again, very supportive of resource development, and they actually see positives, at least on that piece of it, from our perspective in Alaska for resource development. And so there's a lot of opening up of lands that were constrained from development under the Obama administration now. So it's very controversial, obviously, and I'm hearing NPR stories here about some of that work. There are also huge investments in Alaska now for national security. If you look at a globe and you look at where Alaska is in relation to Russia, China, North Korea, it's right there. We have a friend from China here, but it's right there. So there's big, big investment in Alaska now on that front. In terms of our political culture, a recent visitor to the state captured it, I think, really, really beautifully. I mentioned this to George and Brian. He was meeting with a group of Alaskans presenting, and he talked about how tough Alaskans were and adventurous and gritty and hardworking and rugged, self-reliant. But at the same time, he said, I've never seen anybody in the world more dependent on government than you. And a couple of people got upset and left because he really was right. That is a fascinating paradox in Alaska. So now, what's next for the University of Alaska? In response to the settlement with the governor, so instead of 40% in 1 year, 20% 3 years, the Board of Regents withdrew its declaration of financial exigency. So that was a very good thing. It suspended looking at our academic programs at the system level and deciding, okay, we're going to have one school of education as opposed to 3, and this is where it's going to be hard decisions, right, for a board. They suspended that review. They're backing away from, for now, moving from 3 institutional accreditations to 1. So again, a breath of relief. And they they asked me to empower the universities to do their own program reviews at the university level using standard accreditation approved academic review processes. So that's moving forward. Now they're still going to have to find real money, right? So for us, the 20% reduction is 70 million from 327. So that's tranched out over 3 years. So now the university is going to have to come up with that money on top of the reductions that we've already taken. So that will certainly be challenging. But despite these sort of conciliatory, calming, and stabilizing moves, we were quite surprised to receive a letter from our institutional accreditor, the Northwest Commission on Colleges and Universities, expressing concerns about the lack of clarity of roles and responsibilities and the lack of inclusiveness in decision making. And between the Board of Regents and me as the CEO of the Board of Regents and the universities and their separate accreditations. So that has thrown, frankly, and I've said this to the accreditors, thrown some real fuel on a fire that was sort of calming down a little bit, but when you get a letter from the accreditor saying, failure, that word appeared twice in this 2-page letter, you wake up and you start dealing with that, right? So they asked us for a response by October 31st. So I already had 2 calls today, working with the chancellors and the board chair and the vice chair and the general counsel on how we were going to respond to that letter. And in addition to that, our Board of Regents will be meeting Monday to review the response, and then on November 7th to really walk through all those roles and responsibilities between the board on one hand, the universities and the chancellors on the other, make sure those things are all clear. So we'll have accreditation experts in the room, state system experts in the room, because this issue of state systems and campus accreditations is a tense issue, as I'm sure the chancellor and Brian here and others would know. And Connecticut is dealing with it right now. Maine is dealing with it. Pennsylvania, Georgia has been doing a lot of merging. And as somebody I know said recently, the only difference between merger and acquisition is, which side of it you're on, basically. So we're bringing all that expertise into the room as well. So the board, which is a lay board appointed by the governor for an 8-year sentence. I guess term, that was the right term. So amidst all this, storm and drang, we still have to operate a university system, right? We still have to teach and do our research and serve the public. So the board has passed a reduced operating budget for this year, and we haven't given any pay raises in 4 years. So we're actually cutting deeper in order to allocate money for market-based salary increases for faculty and staff. And in addition to that, based on a career I had in business before coming back into higher education, you always need to invest in growth priorities, always, even when you're retrenching. So we're pulling another $5 million or so out to invest in growth ideas and initiatives at the universities, expanding online programs, for example, beefing up nursing clinical opportunities, that's a constraint or a cap on our ability to increase nursing graduates, and those sorts of things. Actually, more match money for research. We can't back off the leading role we play in research. So I expect the budget over the next couple of years to continue with those kinds of reductions, but also investments. But we've got to focus on a few things there. One is our student-faculty ratio. And across the university system, we're at 11-to-1. Our peers are at 18-to-1. Now, I'd love to move to 18-to-1 through increased enrollment, but our enrollment's been declining since 2011, and we've been experiencing that population growth decline since 2016. Some quick story, some years ago I was teaching political geography at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and it's a really fun course, and my boss, the president of the university, asked me, "Hey Jim, how's the class going?" Great, and I went through all the variables that you would need to study and understand to understand the politics of a place, right? Shape, location, rivers, mountains, culture, religion, history, etc., etc. And he goes, "No, Jim, that's all BS." Wait, I'm teaching this, right? Yeah, no, it's all these factors. No, there's one factor. The rest is details. Okay, what is it? Are people trying to get in, or are they trying to get out? That's all you need to know. So, in any case, population is declining in Alaska, so that's a challenge for us. We'll be seeing additional program reductions, I'm sure, and potential consolidations. For sure, continued administrative consolidation, back office stuff. We will be consolidating a lot. Maybe it's an ugly word, monetizing, but physical assets. We own parking garages. Why do we own parking garages? We're not in the parking garage management business. Let's outsource that to somebody who does, get some capital in return. We own a power plant, a huge, very, very expensive power plant. Why do we need to own a heating and power plant? So we're looking at those opportunities. We haven't invested in modern administrative systems in many, many years. So we've got to do that. All of our lives now are mediated by these phones, and companies that we deal with, Amazon, et cetera, have invested a lot of money in excellent ways to separate money from us, right? And we haven't done a very good job of investing in those systems, leaning out processes, expanding collaboration with K-12. We have been experimenting with and have some really successful middle college, high school programs. Some of you may have heard dual enrollment programs, and those are really doing a great job. Those kids come to us then at a much higher rate than otherwise. They've got a year of college done. They require no developmental education at that point, so that's a positive development. And I described for George here a vision that we worked on with a group here in California called UA 2040, where we went through the same protocol that you would go through if you were to make a, say, Minority Report, the Steven Spielberg film. The designer of that film was on the team, and the founder and head of the largest educational game company in the country was on the team. Similar protocol to envision our university 20-some years out into the future. So not completely unconnected or disconnected from where we are today, but far enough away that you can't just sit around a table and do the traditional SWOT analysis that you might do in a strategic planning process. So it's a really fun website, interactive website, and you won't see any silos or bureaucracies in the website. You'll see really a networked type model with students at the core, and then all of the program opportunities they have, again, in a flat sort of network. Making the point about high access, right? And so it was really fun. I'm an empiricist, and so I had some trouble with the consultants when we were working with it. They'd ask the question, what if? Why not? And those were the really provocative questions. And I would say, what does the data say? And look at this report and look at these ratios, and they'd say, Jim, relax. You get to make this up. And so what you're really doing here is creating a process whereby Alaskans can make up their own state, which is a pretty exciting opportunity, because one of the things we lack in Alaska is I would refer to as pull. Here you have huge industry, a huge economy, right, that your students here can be attracted to, pulled to. And in Alaska, that's lacking. Well, who's going to create that? Well, is it going to be somebody from outside of Alaska? So one more time, somebody from outside of the state with outside capital and outside control comes in, and pulls a resource out with as little value added as possible? Or is it going to be Alaskans who create that future? And I'm convinced, based on what I see here, and in every other state in the country, and every country in the world that has a strongly diversified economy, that it's through institutions like this, through universities, that happens. It's the only way it happens. Going through all of this, it's not only a sort of professional challenge, it's also a personal challenge, as you can imagine, having the responsibility of leading a university through these very difficult fights, and having your name and picture on the paper every day, and having extremely negative comments about every move you make in the comments section of the paper. And so I look for solace in different ways. And one, I was talking with George and Brian about this. Moses had a difficult challenge. I'm certainly not the level of leadership of that tremendous historical figure, but he wandered around for about 40 years trying to figure it out, and he had challenges, as he did. He had no confidence votes, as I have had in me, through that period. But there's a great leadership scholar at Harvard named Ron Heifetz, and Ron talks about adaptive changes and problems versus technical problems. Technical problems meaning those you can fix with an Excel spreadsheet or talk about with a PowerPoint presentation. Adaptive problems are very different. They're not susceptible to solution, even with the most sophisticated algorithms we can come up with. And the big adaptive challenge that Ron talks about for organisms, he was a medical doctor before he got interested in policy issues and leadership, but also for organizations. And that is, how do we preserve what is most core about us and honor that, while deciding what to shed in order to keep that and move what is so core and precious to us into a new economic, technological, political, cultural environment. And Ron roots a lot of his analysis, again, in biology, in anthropology, but also in the great traditions of civilization, and how people have had to make these very difficult decisions over time. And they're hard, because you have to decide what is left behind in order to decide what you're going to keep and move forward into a new world. Ron talks about management in a stable environment, leadership in a stable environment being actually fairly straightforward. And he argues there are basically three things leaders need to do in a stable environment. One, provide resources, money, food, whatever that might be. Two is provide security from external threat. And three is manage internal conflict. And when we're not in a crisis mode, those are fairly standard. We have laws, we have rules, we have contracts, we have policies, regulations, cultural mores, all of that. So it's fairly standard. But when you're threatened, right, as we just experienced in Alaska, where your resources are threatened so severely, where a key part of your mission, your purpose, is now made insecure, right, your research mission in particular, and when there's huge internecine conflict, that creates a very serious problem. Rules, policies, laws, contracts, those aren't going to address those kinds of challenges. And so it's all about adapting. It's all about setting up processes where, hopefully calmly and respectfully, and basing the process on the values that we share as intellectuals and people trying to educate the next generation, we can actually make those difficult challenges. But at the end of the day, I actually have a picture in my office in Fairbanks, and it's a picture of a ship, and it's moving through a channel. And on one side of the channel is a cliff, and on the top of that cliff is a hydra, right? And you all know the story from the Odyssey, and that hydra is trying to pick off people off the ship. And then, so the ship can't get too close to that cliff, because the people will get picked off by the hydra. Problem is, if they get too far from the cliff, there's a big whirlpool there, Charybdis, right, in Homer's work. And if you get too close to the whirlpool, you're going down. So the whirlpool was the governor's budget, at least through the last 6 months as I've been thinking about it. And then, of course, the hydra is actually a lot of our own internal politics within the university. And actually, it's a little more complicated than that because we have 3 universities and 13 community campuses. So it's actually 16 ships we're trying to get between this cliff and that hydra reaching down and that big whirlpool that wants to suck us down. So I know those will be there, and hopefully we can keep our eyes focused, on our primary mission and purpose that transcends all of these tensions within and these pressures from without, and again, look forward to teaching Alaskans to grow Alaska. And so that's our existential challenge. It is definitely a rough path, but I'm pretty confident we'll make it through, especially when I meet with students, which I do a lot, and they give me, and we try to bring them to the regents too, to get the regents excited about it, to remember really the purpose here. It's not the spreadsheet, it's not the PowerPoint presentation. It really is a focus on our students and on their future for the state. So that's where we are at this point. I'm happy to address any questions that you might have. Yes?
I think you said the population of the state has been declining since 2016.
Yeah.
I wonder if you know why, and also sort of related question, how well do you do at recruiting students to come to the university from outside Alaska?
Sure. Great questions. We never pulled out of the recession of 2008. Our unemployment is 6.5%. There's a little bit more investment that's gone into the state here recently in the oil patch, and again, military construction. Those are the 2 positives in the state's economy. But otherwise, when say if we reduce at the university, where are those faculty going to go teach? There's no San Jose State, there's no Stanford, they're leaving. So I think that's one of the big reasons. Also, Alaska traditionally has had high churn. So people coming into the state from outside of the state, it's cold there. Wow, it's 22 hours of night in December and it's 50 below, and my family is off someplace else. I think I'm heading home. So I think those are all factors. In terms of recruiting out of state and international students, we get about 10% of our students are international students, and it's largely graduate students studying climate. So we're very, very strong in oceanography, atmospheric physics and chemistry, geology, geophysics. We have a wonderful partnership with Japan. The International Arctic Research Center is a co-sponsored program there. They're very interested in climate issues as well, but we have students from Russia, China, all over the world studying in that specific area.
What about from other states in the U.S.?
Not so much. We have some, but again, those would be really students, graduate students, who are interested in again, those fields. Otherwise, I make a joke sometimes. The state flower is the forget-me-not. And for those of you who've seen the weather reports on Alaska frequently, we're way down by Hawaii, off the southern coast of California, right? And so if you're not in someone's eye, you don't exist. I think we know that from psychology. What you see is all there is, and I think that's one of the challenges. Yes?
So you've said a lot about declines in state funding.
Yeah.
I'm confused why you haven't said anything about tuition. And could you give just a sense of what proportion of your budget comes from tuition, what the conversation around raising tuition is?
Yeah, it's about 40% comes from tuition. The challenge is that supply for higher education in Alaska is a lot higher than demand. We've been increasing tuition at 5% per year, and basically that's been holding us even in terms of gross tuition revenue because enrollment's been declining.
Sure.
So the tuition rate increase has been holding tuition revenue constant. But
what is
only
tuition?
It's about $7,000 a year, undergraduate, in-state tuition.
After the dot-com bust in California, there was a 1-year increase in tuition at the University of California by over 40%. Tuition was a little lower than that, inflation adjusted and similar.
Well, I may be wrong here, and there are experts on the University of California who would correct me, but I think given the demand for higher education here in California, you can just, any of you see Spinal Tap? This is Spinal Tap. You know that mockumentary where you can turn it to 11? You can do that here. We turn it to 11 and we're in trouble. Our students are very, very price sensitive. Here's another sort of gross statistic, and I don't know the exact number here in California. Nationally, roughly 6%, or last time I looked, of the population is studying in some form of higher education. In Alaska, it's 4. Yes?
Can you talk a little more about the likely cuts and maybe your best and worst case scenarios, and in that light, are most of these decisions going to be made at the individual campus level? And to what extent is the governor explicitly or informally affecting, for instance, your climate change research and things like that?
Well, to that, he and his budget director, Donna Arduin, whose name may ring a bell. She was Governor Schwarzenegger's budget director, and also for those of you who've been watching Illinois, a few years ago, she was Governor Rauner's budget director. So she was up in Alaska recently, and there definitely was a targeted approach to research. Even Republican regents got upset about that. Wait a second here, you don't tell us how we're going to reduce. So I think he's not going to push deeply into how the reductions are taken. But your question is a really smart one, and it's one that we're dealing with right now. Are these decisions going to be made by the regents, or are these decisions going to be made by the chancellors? That's essentially the root of the issue. The regents would say, we're going to look at the entire state, and we're going to say, let's have one school of education versus 3, and have one school of engineering, ... So much more vertical approach. The chancellor's approach is, whoa, we're not going to go there. We're going to basically, biggest thing they're doing is using attrition, which you can do for a year or 2, not a very strategic approach. And then there's some reserves. But I think it's going to be really, really difficult so those are that tension though, that issue is what is being teed up over the next year, is how that comes around. The board has been very interested in making more vertical reductions. We, for example, have one school of nursing, and yet that one school of nursing based at one of our universities delivers nursing education all across the state. So the University of Alaska Anchorage delivers that education in Ketchikan, in Fairbanks, in Nome, in Bethel. And the faculty are all UAA faculty, even though they live in these other locations. And so the board's saying, well, why can't we only have one dean? We don't have 3. Why do we need 3 schools of education? If we've shown that with one dean, we can deliver nursing education across the state, why can't we deliver teacher education across the state? We have 19 academic units right now, colleges and schools. There could be 9. Well, then, but as you certainly would appreciate, there are a lot of very difficult decisions going from 19 to 9, right? So where's it going to be? Who's going to be the dean? What faculty get retained? All of those issues are...
What are the educational costs of not having?
Yes, educational costs, although, with technology, you can do a lot these days, and by putting people in different locations. So a bad thing happened last year. The teacher education program at our Anchorage campus lost its program accreditation. Not a good thing. Within days, the other 2 universities came right in, and we transferred those students immediately, and not a single student skipped a beat and graduated right on time. So an advantage of having a system, but I think we can, by deploying faculty and by deploying technology, I think we can cover those. But it really is going to be the tough decision that the board, that will be the difficult decision here in the next year to 2 years, is do we just let the cuts be decided upon at the lower level? My concern is I don't think they can be taken at the lower, because you get to a place where fixed costs come into play. And you either have to get below that that sustainable fixed cost line, and you have no critical mass anymore. you have quality issues. Whereas if you consolidate some things, you can actually have some critical mass. But, obviously to your point, more limited access. So that's the big tension. Good point. Yes?
Of the various constituencies that he annoyed by trying to harm them, is there a path to his political defeat?
The recall effort has legs.
And voter registration drives, get out the vote. I'm assuming there's low voter turnout in the state.
Relatively, yes, but
So when does he run next time on the natural?
2022. But he's fighting the recall, obviously, but there's a very strong group of people pushing for the recall. The chairman, co-chairman, so there are two chairs of the recall effort. One is the only living signator of the state constitution. So he was there in 1956. And the other is the owner of the largest coal mine in Alaska, who's a Republican.
Love those politics.
And one of the big bankrollers of it is a very, very successful former banker. So the bankers, these are sort of business Republicans, are not happy with this because they're looking at the state's economy being wrecked. And so this is not just a left-wing attack at all.
So in a related question, how is K through 12 education fared in Alaska?
On average, not well. Very expensive. And they made it through the budget this year because the legislature forward funded them. So their operating budget was not up for the governor's consideration this year. Now that is being fought in the Supreme Court because the governor says, whoa, you can't constitutionally forward fund, you can't dedicate a subsequent legislature from a previous legislature. The legislature said, call us on it, we're going to court. So that issue is before the court. That said, they were off the hook this past year because of that. But they're going to be on the hook this coming year. Again, very expensive. Rural schools, very troubled. Low graduation rates, low college going rates. That said, at the same time, there is a high school on the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus that puts kids into Berkeley and Stanford and Harvard every single year. So there's a lot of variance, I think. And again, a lot of those kids are university faculty kids, as you might expect. So our kids both went through schools in Alaska, and they both have done extremely well. So, as I understand the research literature, and probably people in this room who know it better than I do, in K-12 education, 70% of the variance in a kid's success is a function of out-of-school variables, and 30% of the variance is a function of in-school variables. And the biggest out-of-school variable, as I understand the literature, is employment. Is there a job in the home? And if there's not, you're going to have issues. And of course, we have the highest unemployment in the country. So, yes.
Do you have a way of measuring your students' postgraduate success? Is there any connection with state employment data, or just some way of making the case that the education you're providing to students is valuable to the state? There's the way to build that.
Yeah, that's a great question. We're able to do it anecdotally with employers who are friends. So the oil industry actually are very friendly to us. They get their engineers from us. And so they are strong advocates. The healthcare industry, very strong advocates. But we've really run into data privacy issues. And one of the upsides of having this permanent fund dividend is people sign up, right? So the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend Corporation has the data on where people are, and they can link that data to the Department of Labor employment data, right? And so the data I just have to catch myself. The data are available, but there are serious issues about funding the analysis of that data and the systems for that data for privacy reasons among our legislators, unfortunately. So we have to rely on that more anecdotal strategy, which actually is pretty effective if you can bring big employers in to advocate on your behalf. Yes.
So, do you see any lessons for the rest of us, or do you think that Alaska is so unique that we shouldn't, that we can't take lessons about what might be down the pike, and whether it's, maybe it's not blue California, maybe it's, well, we know about Kansas and some other places, and what can be, and do you have lessons from other states that you look to and say, well, they manage this kind of crisis, this is how we can do it?
I think the big lesson is to, as soon as possible, if you don't have relevance or perceived relevance in your state, build that relevance as fast as you can. Because I think in our state, we're not perceived to have, by certain politicians, the level of relevance that's needed. We're not essential to the state's economy, according to many people. And so I think if there's a gap there, build it. Another lesson is elections matter. That is for sure. A third lesson, and it is one of the reasons why I decided to create that visionary website, 2040, is a friend of mine came to me and said, how can I help you? And I said, well, because spreadsheets aren't working, PowerPoint presentations aren't working, the rational argument isn't really working. And he said, well, have you read this book called Win Bigly? Have any of you read the book Win Bigly? So it's written by a Bay Area cartoonist, Scott Adams, the Dilbert cartoonist. And Scott Adams is a progressive, liberal Democrat, and in 2015, applying the criteria of persuasion, the principles of persuasion. So he uses Cialdini, the Arizona State expert on persuasion, and he compares two candidates, Hillary Clinton, and so we're looking it up, and Donald Trump. And he concludes in 2015 that Donald Trump will win. And, well, how is this possible? I mean, here we are, people who really believe in data and rational argument and logic and all of that. And the case he makes is that he's a master of persuasion, and he bypasses the neocortex and goes right to the limbic brain. And the naming, for example, is powerful. Scott Adams refers to those as linguistic kill shots. And he uses confirmation bias to his advantage. Now, I read this and got super depressed. I thought, I'm not going to do this. I mean, this is terrible. What's an alternative? Because this is just negative stuff. And while I studied Machiavelli, I'm not going to use those tools, right? And so that's when I thought, create an aspirational vision for the University of Alaska and for the state of Alaska that's positive, that's hopeful. I know that doesn't sound maybe as powerful as some other approach, but in our state anyway, that positive vision is really lacking. And so I thought, if we're not going to do it, who else is going to do that? So that's exactly what we did. I'd encourage you to look at alaska.edu and just scroll down the page a little bit, and you'll see the website, and you'll see a little video about the website. And it is just a relentlessly positive vision for the state's future. And the next step in this, I shared with George here, is to create a game, an interactive game, sort of SimCity type game, where young people are creating Alaska. And so they're not only creating Alaska, we're making it up, right? But they're making it up. Alaskans are making it up, and they're learning along the way. And hopefully they're being pulled through us at the university as they do that. I think there are a lot of states where the politics are really close. We don't pay taxes in Alaska, which I think is really irresponsible of us, frankly. And I think that short-term thinking is very problematic. And I think also the increasing polarization of our politics is very, very problematic in the country. And so I don't know if there's much wisdom in that or much that's generalizable to other places. But at this point, another thing I've learned is going back to some of Heifetz's teaching, while you have to put your heart into everything, you have to be genuine and authentic and totally committed as a leader in an organization like this, going through a crisis like this, your heart's going to get stepped on. And so you better be ready for that. And you better be able to separate role from personality, which of course is a very, very hard thing to do when it's, in part anyway, your personality, that's the reason you're in the role. So that's a challenge that needs to be addressed as well. So kind of a personal thing. Yes, you had a...
I'm just so interested that you said you have to fight for relevance, because
Yeah.
in fact, if Berkeley were to disappear, California would still have wonderful education, higher institution, higher education. But Alaska would be,
We're at,
so how can you not be relevant? It seems,
well,
do you think there's really a lot of people there who would be fine with having no education in the whole state?
I'm not sure a lot. Of the people who go to college in Alaska, so that's 33%, half leave the state for college, half stay. The others don't go on. And I mentioned the correlate, Alaska's way off that line, that very tight distribution of the other 49 states. Well, Wyoming's kind of off the line too, between attainment and income. And so I think, the argument could be just go out. We refer to you all as outside. So just go to Seattle, go outside, go to Berkeley, come on back. Now the history says 80% of the students who leave the state for college do not come back. Both of our kids have not come back. They are working in areas that they love that really they can't do in Alaska. So I agree with you objectively. But again, if we had much higher penetration, if you will, into a lot of industries and a lot of employment areas, but again, a lot of those jobs simply don't require higher education. Yes, and then, yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah, I wonder, obviously, Alaska's an outlier in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But looking back at the political culture there and what's going on right now, you mentioned partisanship, and that the governor, I guess, is sympathetic to Trump. But is there, there's been a lot of analysis here of who are the Trump supporters. And I wondered whether in Alaska, are there as many alienated people? Are they driving, just alienated with everything and are out to disrupt anything that's political or government?
Well, definitely anti-government. There's no question about that. Now, it is big in Alaska. I mean, if you looked at government employment there per capita, you'd say, whoa, it is big. 67% of Alaska's land is federal land. 22% of Alaska's land is state government land. So that's 87, 88, right there. 89, thank you. Native corporations, 10%. 1% is private. Okay, so the largest national forest, the largest national park, are there. So the presence of government is high in the state. And so, there is a lot of, one of the heroes of the state recently won in the US Supreme Court because he had a huge, have you seen these boats that hunters take up rivers in the fall with these big, huge propellers, big, fast, loud, super loud boats. And they run these boats up these rivers to go get moose, get into rural Alaska to get moose. So he was running up a river through a federal land. And the BLM said, whoa, you can't do that. And he said, wait, this is a river, it's an Alaska river, it's not federal, you can't regulate me. Well, they went to the US Supreme Court. So this idea of suing the federal government for what is called overreach is a big deal. So I think there's a lot of antagonism. That's part of the paradox, though, because everybody's getting these checks from government, right? And they're not paying government for things. So it's very strange. There are people who argue for a smaller population, because that's the only way you can not tax anybody and keep handing out a dividend, is to bring the population down, which is, I've studied economics and politics, and sort of capitalism requires growth, right? And it has all of its problems that we all know about, and there are crises that it experiences. But if it ain't growing, it's a big issue. And to actually be in a position of arguing that we should have a smaller population so we don't have to tax people But there is that philosophy there. Very paradoxical.
I'm
Yes.
just curious, this is just a curiosity. Do you know the education or lack of education of your legislators?
Yep. We do.
Is it more of the latter?
To a person.
If they're educated, did they go through your system? And
Actually, we have a lot of alumni, in the legislature. They are less, they were in general very supportive of
Yes,
us,
I
of us
know.
this year.
yeah,
And so I think,
majority, but not a super majority.
and it's 75%. That's just a lot,
Yeah.
right? So we needed 45, we were at 42.
Did your governor go to college?
Yes, he did, he went to our school.
Really?
Yep.
Probably didn't do so well.
Next question. No, he comes from a different political, ideological view. And it's a view that really emphasizes individual rights, and we'll take care of it. We don't want to depend on the government to do these things for us. Instead of giving you the money, university, I'm going to give everybody the money, and if they want to come to you, good, then they'll do that. I don't think it works, but I think, there is that, and that's an old line of political philosophy, political view in our country for many, many years.
But
But
substantively, he believes climate crisis is a hoax.
I think he knows it's happening,
Oh.
because he's lived up in Northwest Alaska where it's definitely happening. I think his issue would be much more about cause and about the cost of mitigation. Everybody knows it's happening. The oil companies know it's happening up on the North Slope because their infrastructure, which is incredibly valuable, is built on permafrost. And if that permafrost melts, you could probably Google Alaska North Slope oil infrastructure and just see photos of it. It is a very industrial place. It's not a huge industrial place, but it is intensive. And if there are issues, it's going to be very, very problematic and very expensive to deal with. Plus that 800-mile long oil pipeline is built on permafrost, discontinuous permafrost, and then no permafrost. And as that permafrost melts, it creates serious issues. Have any of you been up to the interior of Alaska, like Fairbanks area?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so you've been on roads where
Along
they're...
the pipeline.
Okay, so you've been on roads, though, just driving around where they built it. It was nice and flat when they built it, but there was an ice cell, and that ice cell melted, right? And then you go, woo, and they're all over the place and increasing. And then, of course, what happens when the tundra melts? Methane. The tundra is a huge carbon sink. So that is a big, big, big issue. And it is a major challenge in terms of warming.
Yes.
How are you working to draw more people to attend your university system if so many of them think it's easier just to go straight into a career?
Great question. One are these middle college high schools that we've developed, which give high schoolers who are college ready as juniors and seniors, they get college credit and university credit. So they actually come onto our campuses. We either provide them or build them the equivalent of a homeroom. So it's focused just on the high schoolers. And then they leave there, go to classes with university faculty and university students, and then go back to their trailer or room or building or whatever that might be. And so we've got some really neat ones, one for Alaska Native students, one that has a healthcare track. We're looking at one here next year for teachers. So trying to get high schoolers excited about the teaching profession in high school, right? So that is a really good way to link up. Another thing we're doing is developing a virtual middle college high school, particularly for rural kids, so online. And that way they are, wherever they live in the state, they can have a dual enrollment opportunity as well. This is one area where we're cooperating with the governor. There's a bill in the legislature that would mandate all 54 school districts in Alaska to support their students financially so that they could take courses at the university on the school district's dime, not our dime, or the family's dime. And actually, we're cheaper than K-12 is per student, okay? So I think that's a positive opportunity. I just came up with an idea here a couple of weeks ago, and our online folks love it, and that is a financial literacy, online financial literacy course. Turns out that's a big driver of college going and completion, is whether students have financial literacy. So my idea was, let's just have a 1-credit financial literacy course, and part of the course that high schoolers can take. And part of the course is Fafsa Completion. We rank 50th in the country in Fafsa Completion. And we rank 50th in the country in the pro rata share of federal grants and loans that our students receive. So that's kind of cool. Another area where I'm an old labor negotiator, so I'm always looking for common ground with the other side. Another area of cooperation with the governor is our land grant. We're a land grant university that didn't get the land. So only Delaware got a smaller land grant than we did. So Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, these really teeny states got bigger land. I mean, those states are so small you can't even write the name of the state in the state. It has to be written out in the Atlantic Ocean, right? Those states all got bigger land grants than we did. So we're working hard on that issue. And the governor has actually been really supportive of because we need his support to get Congress to deal with that issue. So there are some areas of cooperation with the administration. So I think this visionary website too, I think could be cool, in this game is frankly, in my view, the coolest app that would get kids interested in coming to the university. So if they're sitting there creating their own state's future in a game and competing with each other about how big they could grow the economy, right? Or how much population could they grow, or whatever it might be that they're competing over in the game, I think that would communicate to kids the importance. You make it exciting and create the expectation that they're going to go on. You didn't, I mean, you're expecting to go to university, right? I mean, you're here. But the majority of kids in Alaska do not have that expectation. So we've got to figure that out. And part of it is to create that pull I talked about. Again, here you think Microsoft, right? Or whatever, Apple, all these companies that you could work for. And we don't have that, and we need to create that. And since we don't have it, we're going to have to kind of make it up, I think, too. Now, our faculty are, I'm really pleased with disclosures, invention disclosures. Faculty form corporations. We've got 12 new companies formed by faculty at Fairbanks University. That's nothing like what you have here, but compared to the alternative, it's really good. So that's another step we're taking. Yeah, great question. Yes, George?
Well, one way that the population of a state notices the higher education system is through medical care.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question really is Alaska a net importer, or does Alaska produce enough physicians and other medical care providers to meet the needs of the state?
It's an excellent question. We, along with other low population western states, participate in a program, the acronym is WWAMI, so Washington, Wyoming, Alaska, Montana, and Idaho. We've all partnered up, and the University of Washington is our medical school. Our legislature has bought 20 spots per year in University of Washington's medical school. So we have at any one time 80 Alaskans at the University of Washington. The first 2 years of that medical education are in Alaska. And the second 2 years are in Seattle. And then they come back, hopefully, to practice in Alaska. It's been a very successful program in terms of getting more physicians, Alaskans, into the medical practice. It has, I would say, not, however, associated us as the provider of that care. So, you know, when things get really, really, I mean, we have great medical care in Alaska, but when things get serious, you go to Seattle or here. Yes?
Of the students that go to University of Washington to study, trained to be doctors, how many of them come back to Alaska? You said that 80%.
It's about 60, I would say. Now what happens too is that those other states I mentioned, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, we're all in it's a program. So we actually, some of the students who come up and do their residencies are from those states. If we look at WWAMI students total staying in the state after their residencies, it's more like 80%. So it's great from that standpoint. It only costs the state $3.1 million a year to buy those spots at the University of Washington. So, and that was under assault. That was gutted. The governor vetoed that. He also vetoed our only merit scholarship program that's funded by the state and the only needs-based program. Now those were reinstated and he didn't veto them the second time. So imagine yourself as a university student, maybe a high schooler starting to go to the university, and it's June, and there's still going to be this huge budget cut at your university, and you don't have your scholarship that you earned in high school. And in July, huge budget cut, and you don't have your scholarship. And it was only on August 13th that we made the agreement. August 13th, 2 weeks from the beginning of the academic year. So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, talk about chaos.
Bravo, Jim.
Well, no, it is, I mean, it's a wonderful place, and I don't think I'd be there. And it still is a place of tremendous opportunity. So I think it has all the kind of upsides of the frontier and all of that, but it also has a lot of the downsides in terms of dependence and those sorts of things of the frontier. I don't think I'd be in my role in many other places in the country, especially now after these no confidence votes. But it really truly is a place of opportunity for poor people, and it's especially exciting when I speak to those ANSEP, Alaska Native Science and Engineering Program students and others, and you see the light and you see their great questions. In fact, that reminds me, I spoke to a group this past year, and I had about an hour and a half with them. There were about 60 high schoolers, Alaska Native high schoolers, super smart kids, and I said, you are a consulting company. And I laid out a lot of the numbers I shared with you. And I said, talk to me. How do we get more students coming to the university? How do we recruit more students from outside Alaska? You know, and that sort of made them talk, give me their ideas. They're the experts, I'm not. So it was really, really fun. And there was this one young man off to the side who was very shy, didn't say a thing the whole time. Because these kids are often from villages of 200 people. So this young man sitting over there, and he raised his hand right at the end. Yes, and he's from Huslia, or some little river village. And very serious, had black horn-rimmed glasses, you know. He said, you know what we need in our state? Is a high-growth mindset. Yeah, that's exactly what we need in our state. Thank you very much, you know. But no, it was perfect. He got it, right? I think so many people get it. And so it's a tremendous opportunity, but also a huge responsibility, of course, to try to lay that path out. So, and it's a great lab too. It's a little place, right?
Yeah.
So we can experiment and get some good things done, and then talk with you about what's working.
Well, Jim, I really want to thank you for coming.
Of course. Yeah.
This has been extremely interesting. It's a great example of where we don't want to be in California. But I do want to applaud how well you've been able to work your way through an exceptionally difficult situation. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming and for your questions.